It's hard to explain to anyone under a certain age the grip that Mary Garden had on the public mind. A perfume made in Paris and a roadway over Iron Mountain in South Dakota were named for her. The Parisians spoke of her as though she were one of themselves and gallicized her name into a single French word, Mary Garden, very hard to imitate. New York was a different story. After her debut here with Hammerstein and Thais, the Anvil chorus began about her vocal equipment, a lack of it. One critic observed her high notes were like the snakes in Ireland. Mary didn't get it and asked her father what kind of snakes they had in Ireland. "Mary," he snorted, "don't you know there aren't any snakes in Ireland?" And they do say that when Miss Garden didn't feel like coping with the high D's in Thais, she would point to the note, rattle a bracelet, or wave the inevitable chiffon handkerchief, and you applauded something you'd been hypnotized into believing you'd heard while the orchestra raced merrily on. A lot of this, of course, was sheer exaggeration. She sang the standard works like Tosca and Carmen and Faust, as well as the singing actress parts. In no other record does the premonition of doom hang over the card scene from Carmen as it does in this one by Mary Garden. And here's a recording of Traviata, which the Comique revived for in a new production. I think you'll agree the singer on this record is one of no meager ability. You may have noticed Miss Garden was not singing in Italian. She favored French wherever possible, and albeit a French with Midwest and Scotch overtones, even spoke of Lucia, a role she never sang, as Lucie de Lammermoor. Mozart was Mozart. It was sometimes difficult to know just what she was talking about. She even elected to sing Salome in French, and she was the first Salome to perform the dance herself. Strauss's Shocker had been banished after one performance at the Metropolitan, but Mary blithely tackled Salome at the Manhattan. Those who witnessed it have never forgotten her waiting at the cistern, clean and mysterious as a cat, and as quiet. She knew the potency of silence. I've had more power over an audience with a silence than I ever had with a note. And in another place she says, I used my voice the same way a painter uses his brush. To one of the critics who said she hadn't a voice, she replied, He's right. I haven't a voice. I've 25 voices, one for every role I sing. The president of the Chicago Law and Order League denounced Miss Garden and Salome as a great degenerator of the public morals, and there was a personal encounter with Billy Sunday on the subject. The chief of the Chicago police said in print, "Miss Garden wallowed around like a cat in a bed of catnip." "I always bow to the ignorant and try to make them understand," Miss Garden retaliated, "but I ignore the illiterate." For a while, everybody had a high old time, but the Chicago Opera itself withdrew Salome after 3 performances. No more was heard of the exigent daughter of Herodias until Miss Garden became general manager of the company. She was general manager for 1 season only, but what a season. She began by announcing grandly she would serve as general manager without pay, but she put herself down for 20 performances, needless to say, at the top fee. She produced the world premiere of Prokofiev's Love for 3 Oranges, and in 10 weeks she ran up a deficiency. Miss Garden never used the humble term deficit. It was always deficiency, of $1,100,000. When he reached for fountain pen and checkbook, Harold McCormick gallantly remarked, "It's a pleasure." Those were the days. An incident in connection with her management of the Chicago Opera reveals Mary Garden's single-mindedness about her art. She had a contretemps with Lucien Murator, the French tenor, and by the end of the season, the two weren't speaking. When the company reassembled in the autumn, there was still no greeting. Then the two met at their first rehearsal together. The opera was Monna Vanna, a piece of claptrap by Février based on the play by Maeterlinck, which had its only success because of Mary Garden. At the rehearsal, Muratori sang his aria so beautifully, the icy Mary melted and threw herself into her tenor's arms. Directa, she was called at the Chicago Opera, D-I-R-E-C-T-A, thereby adding a new word to the language. When she took over the job, she announced, "The days of foreign domination are over." When she stepped down, she announced, "My place is with the artists, not over them." Wise Mary. Her last performance in Chicago, and she told no one she was leaving, was as Jean, the pathetic little juggler who dies performing his tricks before the Blessed Virgin. The juggler of Our Lady had always been one of her most enthralling creations. Throughout her career, she was on page 1, and she never had a press agent except her canny and galvanizing self. Her disdain of critics was epic, but she was generous to young artists. On her last visit here, she graciously consented to see Jean Fenn, our young American soprano, then in her first season at the Metropolitan. Miss Fenn had just been engaged to sing the title role in Thais with the New Orleans Opera. "How do you intend to costume yourself?" was Miss Garden's first question. Miss Fenn had in mind white satin. "White satin?" Miss Garden snorted. "Never. Pink chiffon." And she told Jean how she could sew tiny chains into the hem so the material would cling to her handsome figure and reveal the line. You see, she was a sculptress as well as singer and supreme actress. Her power over people, particularly men, was formidable. There was a royal row with Gene Howe, the Texas editor, when Mary, for one of the few times in her life, declined to grant an interview. Amarillo was a one-night stand, and she never gave interviews on performance days. They later met, and of course, Mary had him eating out of her hand. "I'm afraid," Mrs. Howe said as they were leaving, "I'll lose Jean now." To which Miss Garden retorted briskly, "No danger. When I start wrecking homes, I won't begin in Amarillo." Later in her career, she was soloist at a concert of the Harvard Glee Club. Mary was at her best, surrounded by men. As an encore, she sang that little song of Roger's at parting. The sweetest flower that grows, I give you ere we part. For you, it's only a rose. For me, it is my heart. She pulled a flower from the giant bouquet which had just been delivered over the footlights and handed it to one of the dewy Harvard undergrads seated behind her. He blushed furiously. The audience applauded wildly. And next day, Philip Hale wrote in the Boston Herald, "The high point of the evening was when Miss Garden placed the rose on the unknown soldier." They came to hear Caruso. They came to hear Melba, she used to say, but they came to see Mary Garden. Mary didn't like her records, and she didn't make many. Some of them, I think, are wonderful. This old and familiar song, I think, gives you an excellent idea of that veiled voice, that sonorous mirage which always had about it some of the moonstruck and shadowy quality of Mélisande. Certainly, it reveals her extraordinary power of communication in the gloaming. The one record of Miss Garden to win her seal of approval is an American song, which used to be heard at weddings. "The only record of mine," she said, "that I would knowingly permit anybody to play in front of me is at Dawning." The woman who sang that may have been, as she suggested in her book, incapable of love. But on the stage, and to Mary Garden, that's what really mattered, she could make you believe otherwise. For the last 5 years of her life, Mary Garden was in a hospital and later a nursing home in Aberdeen. There was an explosion of a gas stove, then a fall in which she broke both arms. There were times when she didn't know who she was or where she was, a pathetic end for a creature so vital. But there was a moment, a supreme moment, the Associated Press reported it, in the spring of 1962, when she sang, perhaps for the last time. She was 87, and the audience must have been the most unusual of her long and eventful life, a packed ward in the Royal Infirmary of Aberdeen, doctors, nurses, patients. It's the first time I've sung in public for many, many years, she said. And like wind in summer sighing, the voice was low and sweet. One of the last times I saw Mary Garden on her visit to this country 12 years ago, she told me one day, with no preparation whatever, for no apparent reason at all, about having visited John O'Groats up there in the very north tip of Scotland, where the land becomes sea. You see, she really was Mélisande. And she described having seen a little boy on the rocks. Do you wonder that's the first thing I thought of when I heard over the air last month that Mary Garden had died? Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. and the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is stilled.